Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called The Perfect 10. It is called The Perfect 10, the 10 essential jazz rock fusion albums, according to me. Okay, so it's my subjective viewpoint, although I think I do have most of the prime contenders for the 10 essential albums. It's not going to be in any particular ranking order. I'm not going worst to best. There's no way you can compare these albums, say one's better than the other. But they will be in the order of release from earliest to latest. So we get some story of the development of jazz rock fusion as we go through. All the releases from the 1970s. I think if you're going to pick 10 albums to represent this genre, they're going to come from the 70s. There's some fantastic fusion albums from the 80s, 90s, all up to 2000 up to date. But I think if we're going to come up with the prime contenders, as you will see, they're all from the 1970s for me. Right, so let's kick off with my first from 1970, released March 1970, I believe, and it's this album. Now, this is not the actual album. This is the box set that collects all the sessions together. I don't know if you can read that. Have I got it upside down? Of course I have. I always have to have it upside. Miles Davis. This is the box set of Bitches Brew. I'm afraid I don't own my vinyl copy anymore. It wore out many years ago. This album here is, for many people, the beginning of the jazz rock fusion genre. I don't think it is. I've done a video where I go through the origins of jazz rock, but it's a very, very important album. Why is it important? Firstly, it sold a lot of records. You know, this was a big seller, and it's a difficult album to listen to as well. It's not a commercial sellout, and I think that's the point. The second thing that Miles did on this album was show a way you could fuse jazz and rock music without selling out, without it just being a way of making jazz more commercial. This is really difficult music to listen to. In fact, when I bought this album as a kid, I didn't like it when I first heard it. I had to sit with the headphones on and really listen to it, and when I got it, it completely changed my view of music. It then took me towards John Coltrane, free jazz, experimental music, modern classical music. You know, as a youngster trying to get my head around this, you know, that was like going to music college for me. Why did I bother? Because of the lineup. That's the other thing about this album. If you look at the lineup on this album, it's basically all the prime contenders, or many of the prime contenders that are going to be on the albums that I'm about to go through. You know, not all, but many. You know, John McLaughlin, Wayne Shorter, Joe Zawinul, Billy Combs on these sessions, Jack DeJohnette, Bernie Maupin, who else is on here? Lenny White, Chick Corea. It just goes on and on. Larry Young. I think this is a hell of an album. It's a difficult album. I may well do a video for people who will have problems with this album, talking about ways to approach it. You know, I think that'd be a really interesting video to do. Because if you're having difficulty with an album, it's because you're trying to find things in it that aren't there, and you're not listening to the things that are there, and you have to work out the things that are there. You know, I may have just explained it all in that one sentence. Anyway, that's my first one. Then from 1970, also from 1970, another masterpiece, Hot Rats by Frank Zappa. You know, now someone said on the comments this is from 1969, and it is actually. I think it was released October 1969, so it shouldn't really be on my list. I think this is a favourite of us British Frank Zappa fans because it went into the top 10 here in the UK, and it was actually released around about February 1970. So, am I allowed to put this one in? You know, so I think so, because this also I think is really, really important for the development of jazz rock fusion. Plus, it's a masterpiece. All the tracks on here are absolutely fantastic. And what we basically get on this album is two things. We get Frank Zappa's incredible composition approach with tracks like Peaches on Regalia, Little Umbrellas, It Must Be a Camel. All these tracks really show you Zappa's incredible compositional approach. Zappa's one of the great composers, and in his compositional approach is a mixture between rock music, sort of cheap pop music, jazz, modern classical music, the blues, you know, all those things are put together in such an interesting way. And of course, that way of composing has really been influential on jazz rock fusion. But also, it really showcases his guitar style. He is basically a blues rock guitarist, but an experimental blues rock guitarist. And I think the way he approaches improvisation within a rock band context is very important to how jazz fusions then in the future went on to do that, you know. And it's an incredible album. So that's my next album. Right, so the next album I'm going to put in from 1971 is, of course, The Inner Mountain Flame from the Mavish Orchestra. The Mavish Orchestra obviously are going to be in here. They're possibly the most important jazz rock fusion band of all time. And of course, anyone who's come to this channel has probably come here because you're a fan of the Mavish Orchestra. I'm a huge fan of the Mavish Orchestra. When I did my top 10, I put Birds of Fire at number 1, very contentiously, and had a lot of people telling me I was a fool for not putting this one at top 10. In terms of essentialness, in terms of influence, in terms of just raw power of creating this genre that we love, this is the one to listen to. Yes, these ideas were developed further on Birds of Fire, and yes, that sort of Jan Hammer Moog sound is not here, that Billy Cobham machine gun double bass drum thing is not here, but believe me, it's represented on the other albums I've got in the list. So from 1971, The Inner Mountain Flame, right? If you want me to hear me talk about this at length, I have a whole video just on this album, so go and check it out. Right. The next few albums are all related to the Mavish Orchestra. And I think this really shows the influence of this band on this genre. And I think, on the whole, everyone's going to say that this one should be in as well. Billy Cobham, Spectrum. This is Billy's R&B take on the Mavish Orchestra. It's like a funkier Mavish Orchestra. He also expands the sounds. He's got a little bit of brass on there, which he then goes to do even better on Crosswinds and Total Eclipse. But God, this is one hell of an album. It contains some fusion classics like Quadrant 4, you know, Stratus, you know, let's open it up. I've got the gatefold. I've got the actual original vinyl here, so that's what's it like inside. There's Billy on the back. It's got Tommy Bolin, who's a fantastic guitarist, but Tommy's a rock guitarist. He's jazz influence, he's a rock guitarist, a bit like Jeff Beck. And that's a masterstroke for this album. So yes, Spectrum. But I think this as well, another Mavish new spin-off. This is probably my most contentious choice in this 10 essential albums. I really believe this to be one of the greatest fusion albums ever made. And if you don't know it, you need to go and check it out. Oh Yeah, by Jan Hammer. Right. Jan Hammer was so important an influence on jazz rock fusion. The keyboard soloing sound that most jazz rock fusion bands use at this time came from him. He's not doing it so much on Inner Mountain Flame. But by this point with his own band, he'd taken it to another level, right? But that's not the only reason to get this. This is just one of the most face-melting, mind-blowing jazz fusion albums ever made. If I was ranking these, this could come up very, very high on my list. And a lot of the times when people say, you know, what's jazz rock fusion? You know, my students will say it, and I put a track on, right? The track I actually put on is the first track off this Magical Dog. If you haven't heard that track and you're a jazz fusion fan, go and listen to it now. I think it could perhaps be my favourite jazz rock fusion track. I haven't given that much thought, but that's how much I rate this album. Oh Yeah by Jan Hammer. What a masterpiece. Okay, sorry, here's another Mavish Orchestra album. I put 2 in. Okay, this is possibly my favourite album, and I would possibly say it's the greatest jazz rock fusion album ever made. I know people are going to have a go at me for this. Visions of the Emerald Beyond. A couple of people, when I rated this so highly in my Mavish New Top 10, came along and said this was sort of commercialised Mavish Orchestra or disco-fied Mavish Orchestra. That's just simply not true. Anybody who's listened to the last track on here, I'll just open it up, which is called On the Way Home to Earth. I never couldn't quite remember the title of that. I wanted to get it right. Look at that. That's the inside. There we go. On the Way Home to Earth is some of the furthest out jazz rock fusion or Mahavishnu stuff on record. You know, there's some incredible stuff live where John McGoughlin really takes it out, but in the studio, it's probably miles out off Inner Worlds, but that's not a successful album, and I don't think they do it as well as they do on here. Yes, this has some much more accessible Mahavishnu moments. It's got vocals at certain points, but it stretches the genre out. You know, there's classical interludes, there's like acoustic guitar interludes, but there's some of the most ferocious and funky jazz rock fusion playing ever, because the funk is really important to jazz rock fusion. Don't let anybody tell you it's not. Okay? When I was a kid, I really sort of used to differentiate between jazz rock, which was the sort of rock and jazz, Mahavishnu, Return to Forever and all that type of stuff, and then the disco-y jazz funk, right? And I felt that the disco-y jazz funk was a bit of a sellout, and on the whole it is, you know, but the heavy stuff was the more proggy rock end of fusion. Of course, it's not true, and it's disproved by this album, the next album on my list. Headhunters by Herbie Hancock, right. This is about as funky as it gets. But it's also got some of the most fiery playing. What do I look for with jazz rock fusion? What I want is people pushing the envelope, creating new sound worlds. I want it to be as funky, but as rocky and as heavy as it can be. And I want the people to really play. What lets down so many jazz rock fusion albums is they don't actually solo, they don't play, they just don't let loose. This album does the lot. It's only got 4 tracks on, you know, because the tracks go on for so long. Chameleon, that was a hit record for Herbie. You know, it went in the charts. It's a dance track. But when you listen to the original, which is 15 minutes long, once the sort of single version ends, it just then takes off and they just tear it to bits. Right, and then the next track, Watermelon Man. This is a cover of an earlier track by Herbie Hancock, and it starts off with that iconic whistle sound, right, which I think is Bill Summers just blowing the top of like a Coca-Cola bottle and singing at the same time, and he creates this rhythm. That's an iconic moment for jazz fusion, and then when the groove kicks in, it's so funky. Then you turn it over and you hit Sly. 10 minutes of just face-melting jazz fusion. They are just flying on this, absolutely flying. And then it ends with Vein Melter, this dark, heavy funk. This is a heavy album and it's a funky album, right? Now, if you look at my channel, I haven't covered much Herbie Hancock on this channel. I am a huge Herbie Hancock fan. He is an icon of jazz rock fusion. He's so important. The reason why I haven't got a top 10 is because my top 10 is over at Sea of Tranquility. So if you want to see my top 10 Herbie Hancock albums, pop over to there. But I will be coming back to Herbie Hancock in the future. But like I said, this is one of the greatest albums ever made. Right, so that's the one end. That's the funky end. The funky end of jazz rock fusion. What about right up the other end, the prog end, the rock prog end, the fast guitar end, of course. Return to Forever. Right, I love all the Return to Forever's albums. Hymn to the Seventh Galaxy was nearly here because I think in terms of influence, that's the one that came out and really, you know, pushed jazz rock fusion a little bit further forward. But in many cases, they are chasing what the Mahavishnu did. They're brilliant because they don't compromise their sound. It's Stanley Clarke, Al Di Meola in the early days, Bill Connors, Lenny White. They really create their own sound. It's not the Mahavishnu, it's just informed by them. And I think they just get better. They come out with this incredible sound that they just fine tune. You know, on the albums before this, they're exploring the funk a little bit more. They're also exploring the prog influences a little bit more. And then finally they come with this, which is just a masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. It's also the first Return to Forever album I ever bought, which was very lucky for me. You know, I can remember taking it home and putting it on, and I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. I also think it's the greatest prog instrumental album of all time. It's got look at that. That is one of the greatest prog covers ever made. Let's just turn it around, see them on the back. Look at that. Absolutely brilliant. This is just a stunning album. It represents Al Di Meola. You know, I think Al Di Meola has to be in there, on one of these albums because he's so important. As is... Right, sorry, I've just got out of order. As is two guys on the next album I'm going to talk about. Now, I've searched my collection trying to find this, and I cannot find it, so I can't hold it up. But my second to last album, my 9th album on the list, would be Believe It by Tony Williams, Lifetime. Now, I was going to put in Emergency. Emergency is the first album by the Lifetime with John McLaughlin and Larry Young on. God, it's an incredible album and so important to the history of jazz rock fusion. But it's a difficult album from someone coming to the genre for the first time, and it's not well recorded. I think it's a hard album to get your head round. But in terms of fusion, I think that Believe It is equal to that. I think when that album came out, Tony Williams really nailed his way of playing jazz rock fusion. Of course, Tony Williams is one of the greatest drummers of the 20th century. I see him as the real father of modern drumming, and he is perhaps the most important drummer in the development of jazz rock fusion. And he plays incredible on this album. But it also featured Alan Holdsworth, and I had to have Alan Holdsworth on the list. You know, what am I going to say about Alan Holdsworth? Well, I think Alan, you know, I revere him so much as a musician. I think, you know, he's perhaps the greatest musician produced by rock, jazz fusion, prog, you know, whatever you want to call this music that's been around for the last 50, 60 years. Alan Holdsworth might be the peak instrumentally, you know. Not just the greatest guitarist, but possibly the musician that's taken the most important instrument of the 20th century the furthest out. I can't say much more, right? Here's my number 10. Here's my last album. It's not the greatest, this is not a ranking, this is my last album. Weather Report by Heavy Weather. Right, it nearly was Black Market. That is my favourite album. But I just think in terms of influence and importance, you've got to have this in here for Birdland, because Birdland is like the signature tune for jazz rock fusion. It's the big hit. It's also one of Jaco Pastoris's finest moments. And I think we need to represent Jaco on the list. Right, so they're my 10 essential prog... No! My essential jazz rock fusion albums. I'm a prog musician as well, you know this, and a lot of those would be my essential prog albums, hence the Freudian slip. I'm now going to do another video where I talk about the importance of the musicians on here. What I wanted to do was put those albums out there and then go through them again and talk about the importance of the musicians on there. So these will be the essential musicians of jazz rock fusion. You know, should be, you know, but I felt like I needed to just talk about 2 more musicians. So these aren't on the list, but I really wanted to put them in here. One album I think that is very important to this genre is Duster by Gary Burton. Gary Burton's a really important musician in the development of jazz rock fusion. I'd say he is one of the originators of it. There's 2 I want to talk about, and this is the first one. Gary Burton's sound then goes on to inform the Pat Metheny group, and that's another important sound. I don't own a copy of Duster. It's a fantastic album. It's one of the first artistically successful fusions of jazz and rock to come out of the States. I think the UK guys did some incredible stuff like McLaughlin with Graham Bond and stuff like this. But one album I do really like that I'm just going to put forward to represent Gary Burton and this early fusion thing is Throb, which I think is from the Year album. So this is from something like 1968, 69. So that's what I'm going to put forward here. And then, to finish up, I want to just mention one album which I haven't talked about on this channel, believe it or not, and it's this one. Larry Coryell Spaces. Larry Coryell is a very important musician in the history of jazz rock fusion. Again, he's an originator. The problem with Larry is he just never really made that defining essential album. The closest is possibly this, Spaces, which he made by John McLaughlin. I haven't talked about this album that much because I'm a huge McLaughlin fan. I'm a huge Larry Coryell fan. I was never really a fan of this this album. And I think partly it's because they haven't quite got the jazz rock fusion right. It's a lot of swinging jazz. I think it's very important because no one had heard anyone play the guitar like that. But of course, we know Larry Coryell and McLaughlin from later albums where they've taken this out further out. But it is a very artistically successful album. I think that's the important thing here. You know, it's an album where you could see the validity of people bringing in rock influences, not just to try and sell the album. So just wanted to put that forward. So yeah, now if you want to move on to my next video, it's going to be called, you know, the essential musicians of jazz rock fusion. I'm going to have a chat about that. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next video, hopefully. Bye.